lonely man prepares for a romantic evening. His date is on her way. She, too, is looking forward to tonight. They've talked about it and planned for it together. This is the night they've both been waiting for, a chance to fulfill their fantasies.
Hi. What are you doing?
But the man is about to learn that their fantasies are worlds apart. In true crime, investigation and conviction may take years. But every detective knows that the crucial clue is always there, somewhere in the first 72 hours. Houston, 1995. Jal Namir is being robbed by two women. They work together like pros. They seem to have done this before. But tonight, they've made a big mistake. They've brought along a rookie to guard their victim. He polishes off the knockout drink meant for Jal and passes out cold. Jal calls the police before the women have a chance to cover their tracks.
The first time I was called into the case was during a period where we didn't know who these two women were, but we knew the MO, we knew what they were doing.
Dan RIZZO, Harris County, Texas prosecutor, a man who thinks he's jailed every kind of criminal, until now.
In this case, it was a series of robberies that were being committed against men who mistakenly thought that they were going on a date with one or two women.
There have been 6 reported attacks over the last several weeks, all following a similar pattern.
In the telecommunication dating service, they would look for a category that was more kinky, thinking that if they robbed those people would be less likely to report their crime to the police. They also seemed to go after foreign men, people that were less sophisticated with our culture and people that would be easier to locate and to victimize.
But Jal Namir is the first victim to raise the alarm in time for police to pursue the women. Police checked Jal's phone records and discovered that several calls were made to his home from a payphone at a Houston hotel.
They went and talked to employees of that location, and someone from the hotel said, yeah, they were in such and such room.
The women are arrested. They're identified as Rose Turford and Carolyn Stevens, and they're charged with aggravated robbery. Because of their use of firearms and threats of violence, bail for both is set high at $500,000. The women secure a bail bond and are released. Nancy Smith works for a bail bond company that's responsible for guaranteeing the bail, making sure the women stay in Houston and attend their trial. She lays down strict conditions to ensure they don't leave town.
The conditions that we put on them is that the girls had to report to me every day by phone. Twice a week they had to come to the bond office, sit down with me, check in. Part of the agreement is that Rose and Carolyn could have no communication whatsoever.
While Smith keeps track of Rose and Carolyn, RIZZO begins to investigate the women's backgrounds. He needs to build a case to prosecute them for the string of crimes police allege they have committed. He starts with Rose Turford.
She was living in a very nice upper middle class neighborhood in what appeared to be a beautiful home, and didn't appear to have any criminal background that we could find anyplace.
Carolyn's life has been lived equally far from the world of crime.
Carolyn Stevens, likewise, had no criminal background. Her father was a minister, a very nice family from what I understand, although Carolyn had a history of mental distress.
RIZZO wonders, what would make these two seemingly normal women commit such crimes? Within 72 hours of their arrest, RIZZO gets a major break in the case.
We had done a search warrant at a location where they had a storage shed. We found thousands and thousands of pages of letters that were written from a person by the name of Avery, Orlando Avery.
Every piece of these bizarre communications is addressed to Carolyn Stevens. And these are not like any correspondence RIZZO has ever seen before. They are written in code, a seemingly random pattern of squares and lines. But when properly connected, they form individual letters.
We had to put them into some kind of an order. We then had to make copies of each one so that we could draw in the lines to try and tell what, in fact, was being said in the letter.
RIZZO staff works on the huge task of decoding the letters. Buried among the piles of paper, RIZZO makes another discovery. A sheaf of yellow, legal-sized pages covered in Rose Turford's handwriting. To his astonishment, he begins reading what appears to be a diary. Rose begins her story by describing a shattered marriage and her move from Canada to Houston, her search to make a new life and new friends. I met Carolyn Stevens while working at the hospital. She's quiet and reserved, and we became friends quickly. She told me she also worked for a private investigator named Mr. Avery. In February or March '94, Carolyn became a regular in my house. She was great with my daughter Lindsay and quickly became part of the family. When she needed a place to live, I invited her to move in. As RIZZO reads on, the tone of Rose's diary takes a much darker turn. In May '94, Carolyn disappeared for several days. She returned with 2 gunshot wounds. She said they were a punishment by Avery for blowing her part of an important investigation. RIZZO wonders, what kind of man would do this?
Carolyn would show up at work with things on her arms and her legs, and by things, we're talking about bruises and scrapes and cuts. And initially, Carolyn told Rose Turford and others that she hurt herself while she was working doing landscaping. Eventually, she said that she was being forced into some sort of servitude by a person by the name of Avery.
Rose records increasingly painful punishments inflicted on Carolyn. Suddenly, Rose herself comes to the attention of the mysterious Mr. Avery. He sent me a note at that time outlining that if I wanted to help Carolyn, it was okay, as long as I kept him and his identity secret. I had no intention of getting Carolyn in more trouble by going to the police. I understood we had to play by Avery's rules. RIZZO is now looking for a third person linked to the crimes. He needs to question Rose and Carolyn to find out more about the obviously dangerous Orlando Avery. But 3 weeks after the women are released on bail, Rose and Carolyn fail to appear for their weekly meetings with Nancy Smith.
I first called Carolyn's house, and I was informed by her parents that they didn't know where she was. So I turned around and called Rose's family. And I'm told the same thing.
The women have vanished. The bond company needs Nancy Smith to find them, and fast.
Well, I'm working for somebody that's going to lose $500,000 apiece on 2 people. And that's not petty cash.
And the police are about to discover they have a completely different kind of investigation on their hands. Rose Turford and Carolyn Stevens are wanted for a series of violent robberies in Houston, Texas. Now they've vanished. The only clue to the women's disappearance is a chilling note found on Rose's bed. I have come to repossess my girls. Signed, Orlando Avery. Nancy Smith tries to track the women, scrambling to secure their $500,000 bail bonds. Dan RIZZO, the prosecutor on the case, joins the search for the missing women, now fugitives from the law.
There were sightings of them all around Canada, so we thought that they were up in Canada where Rose Turford was from.
Rose reports in her diary that Avery is an international criminal. Now it appears he has spirited the women out of the country. As RIZZO scours the diary for clues to a connection in Canada, he uncovers more proof of Avery's disturbing control over Carolyn. She began returning from meetings with Avery covered with strange tattoos. They could be removed by harsh scouring. And Avery instructed the women that the markings had to be completely gone within a certain time, or he would punish Carolyn again, more severely. One night, Rose finally came face to face with her nightmare. I saw Avery. I was in shock. He just calmly looked at me and then turned away. From then on, Rose knew Avery was watching them closely. Avery made a point of driving by the house in his limo frequently. He wouldn't stop or say anything. He would just put his window down so that I could see it was him while he passed. RIZZO realizes that Avery had the women in his grasp long before he kidnapped them, and he controlled their every move.
It was always Carolyn who was communicating with him in person, would receive a letter for Rose, and it was always directed at Rose, telling her what to do.
In case the women tried to escape, Carolyn revealed that Avery had forced her to install surveillance devices in Rose's house. Rose's diary details an increasingly disturbing triangle between Carolyn, Avery, and her. Avery's escalating punishment of Carolyn becomes remorseless. I ask Carolyn to look up at me, and when she does, pain, fear, and confusion are the emotions. My eyes don't leave hers as I tell her I'll make everything better. Her tears are my response as she whispers, "I hope so." But Rose is helpless to protect either Carolyn or herself from Avery's reach. When she does try to pull away, he demonstrates his power over their lives by snatching Rose's daughter, Lindsay, from the family's backyard. About an hour later, Avery came back with Lindsay. He said I can't stop him from taking any of the girls anytime. He was glad I was smart enough not to call the police, because if I did, I wouldn't see the girls again. Rose makes it frighteningly clear that her life too has fallen totally under Avery's demonic control. It's at this point in the diary that RIZZO learns how Avery forced the women into crime. Rose writes that he was no longer satisfied with just controlling them mentally and physically. Now he wanted money. And this meant he had a new task in mind for Rose and Carolyn. Avery called his new task the heist game. He sent Rose and Carolyn to a hotel in Las Vegas, where they were instructed to begin the game by robbing a hotel guest. A man approached. He was already pretty drunk and made me aware that he was interested in having sex with me. He talked about money, but I told him I wasn't a prostitute. I was just looking for a good time. He had a fantasy of being with two women, so we played along. But we really messed up. Carolyn accidentally hurt herself with the stun gun we brought. Thank God that guy was so drunk that he passed out. He didn't even realize he was being robbed. Avery said we were pitiful and had a lot to learn. Avery took charge and decided to fine-tune the heist game. He directed Rose to use a telecompanion's phone dating service. She was to concentrate on men looking for action in 3 categories: exotic adventure, fantasy fulfillment, and Three's Not a Crowd. It was Rose's job to set up dates with the right men.
Rose Turford would talk to them about whether they had a house, talk about their car, and basically in a very subtle way try and discern whether or not they were working, whether or not they had any property, some type of property that would be worth stealing.
RIZZO finds lists in Rose's diary that reveal the women quickly collected a detailed roster of candidates for robbery. In very little time, they had lined up 20 potential victims.
They had their height and their weight. They had their physical build, all the different things that would help them to determine whether or not this would be the perfect one to go after next.
RIZZO realizes that with Avery as the mastermind behind Rose and Carolyn's robberies, he's the most dangerous of the three. It means that in order to find the women and put an end to their crime spree, police must capture Orlando Avery.
We used every law enforcement agency that we could muster up help from. The FBI, Interpol actually assisted us. We had descriptions, we had approximate ages, we had some other identifiers, we had potential areas where he may have lived or owned property. The quicker that we found them, the better, because we figured at some point we were going to end up with potentially somebody dead.
Police have now been on the trail of Rose Turford and Carolyn Stevens for almost 6 months. The two women are wanted for a series of robberies and are believed to be on the run in Canada with their abductor, Orlando Avery. But in all of the sightings of the women, there is never any mention of a man with them. For RIZZO, the picture of Avery controlling the women from a distance just doesn't add up.
For myself, it just seems so far-fetched that somebody, some international criminal, would be communicating with them through thousands of pages in this block print code to try and tell them to do things which didn't make any sense.
If Orlando Avery isn't pulling the strings, then what's really going on? The answer could be near. Nancy Smith is starting to close in on Rose and Carolyn.
I went to Canada twice after we had exhausted all of everything from here. We went to Montreal, and the girls had been seen there.
By now, the pair are notorious.
There was a media circus for looking for Thelma and Louise, as they dubbed them.
Their faces are broadcast on American television. Newspapers and magazines on both sides of the border pick up the story.
We were back home maybe 2 or 3 days, if that much. And we got a phone call from a gentleman saying, "I think I have somebody you're looking for." Well, we'd already heard this so many times. You're like, okay, just tell me what you have.
In Toronto, the operator of a phone sex line recognizes Rose as the woman who handles the S&M calls. After 6 months on the run, the pair are arrested without incident.
They laughed about it the whole time. I mean, for somebody that knew they were fixing to have to come back to Houston, Texas and face all these charges, they just laughed.
Give us a kiss, girls. Come on, give us a little kiss.
Rose and Carolyn are brought back to Texas to stand trial for armed robbery. While in prison, both women insist that Avery visits and continues to threaten them. But Nancy Smith isn't convinced.
If you've ever been in our jail here to visit anybody, you know you have to have ID, and they run you to see if you're wanted anywhere. And nobody by that name ever came.
Both Nancy Smith and Dan RIZZO now uncover the astonishing truth about the devilish Orlando Avery.
There wasn't an Orlando Avery. He didn't exist.
RIZZO doesn't believe either woman was ever really in danger, no matter how much Rose's diary claims that she feared for her life. RIZZO believes the entire story was a fantasy, created by Rose and Carolyn. What had started out as a friendship between the two women grew into something dark, violent, and sexual.
What I did find out was that they were both in it together. There was no one person who was the stronger and the other being the weaker. Carolyn physically was being the one abused by Rose. However, she also was manipulating Rose in this twisted relationship they had.
RIZZO now understands that it was Carolyn who wrote the letters. She was the one setting the rules. She and Rose expanded their sexual fantasies to acts of crime, fueling the excitement they enjoyed in playing their dominant and submissive roles.
It's the power, it's the control, and it's the violence. They enjoyed all of it. It was something that they really were having fun with.
Carolyn finally gives up the Avery fantasy. She admits that she created him. She is offered a plea agreement and chooses to make a deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to aggravated robbery, Carolyn is sentenced to 10 years in prison.
After Carolyn pled guilty, I said, well, why were you doing this? I mean, I know that there was no Avery. Why were you doing this? And she said, she just kind of looked up real quietly and said, it was the game.
It's a game that Rose Turford can't quit. She refuses to let go of the Avery fantasy. At her trial, she still insists that he is dangerously real. She maintains her innocence, but is found guilty. Rose is sentenced to 30 years in prison for playing the game and losing.
The stories on 72 Hours are true. The detectives and forensic scientists are the ones who actually worked on the case. The names of the victims are fictitious. The names of the convicted are real.